they didn't advertise. So I did not mention that. And then I did not mention that he uses working with students to, our students to environmental management. So if that comes up, we'll ask those questions, because I'd love to hear. I'm going to be in and out.
You did?
I think so.
Yeah, but there's cookies and stuff over here.
Long time no see.
Yeah, right. Fancy running. You guys at Watersheds.
Yesterday, we were at the water talk.
That should be all right. Sorry,
Yeah. No, sweat.
Design, yeah, the SRM design of water. The water markets.
Watershed and Rochester, nice and all. Section design.
Yeah, I think it's just a down key.
Yeah, I think you can just push the page down or the down key.
And then, let's see, we still have, Jeff was coming back, wasn't he?
Yes.
Did he say anything to you?
It kind of sounded like it, but I'm not sure.
I thought he was. We'll give him a minute or so, and if he doesn't, then we'll just have John get it started.
Whatever you.
Okay. He's standing outside, making sure no one else is banging on.
Get lost. You see if anybody else is out there.
He's not here.
Jeff's not coming?
Yes, he is, but he's not here.
Okay.
Did you hit record already, David?
Yeah.
Okay, I will just cut this part.
All right. So thank you very much for coming today. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Lewis Smith, who's with Smith Partners. Just to tell you that Smith Partners has been a supporter of the Water Resource Science Program through a fellowship that we have running within the program. Students that are awarded that fellowship get the opportunity to interact with Smith Partners, specifically with Lewis Smith, as a result of having that fellowship. So his title is, for today's presentation, is Breakthroughs in Collaboration to Create and Sustain Great Conservation Corridors. Very important topic here in Minnesota. And I'll just give a little background on Lewis. He devotes his practice to public law and government litigation. He has extensive experience in urban development and the planning and implementation of public infrastructure improvements. For example, he counseled the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District in structuring the Minneapolis Chain of Lakes Clean Water Partnership, which is undertaking the largest urban lake restoration project in the United States and has received 3 environmental awards. So with that, I think I'll let Lewis get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all very much. I want you to know, first and foremost, what an honor it is for an old guy like me to be invited here and spend time with you. And earlier in the day, I had the chance to visit with many of you, and I really savor that time. I will be really eager to hear your questions and have some more discussion as we continue this conversation. I've really done 2 things in my career now, 30 some years, and that is work with watersheds and specifically watershed districts in Minnesota and counsel it to create public-private partnerships that have focused on urban neighborhoods that are challenged or transit corridors. And now I'm finding more and more in my work to focus on watershed issues. So doing watershed work with public-private partnerships as a part of the way we go about this work has become really important to me. What I want to get across to you today in the end is just 2 things, and it all has to do with connectivity. The first is interdisciplinary work. And you connected here at the Water Resources Center or other parts of the university know all about the value of that work. But as younger graduate students, you're in a pathway right now of gathering up really specialized knowledge. And that will be marketable expertise in the academic world, in local government, in the conservation world, wherever you might discover that you want to work. What I'd urge you to think about is the connectivity of reaching over to other disciplines and learning how to work with people who are coming at solving a problem with a whole different orientation than what your training has brought. I'd even encourage you to think about a secondary piece of your training, maybe another kind of a minor in another discipline, or joining together the way you think about things. Just having one more set of tools in your toolbox, kind of your side hustle, is going to help you not only compete in the marketplace wherever you're going, but it's also going to help you be a problem solver. Because more and more, what we're finding is that whether it's in the watershed world or anywhere else, one narrow discipline is not going to be the generator of the solution. It's going to be multiple disciplines leveraging multiple resources. And it's resources that's a second message I want to get across to you today. And that is the connectivity of thinking about both public and private sectors. I'm going to guess that many of you might be destined to work in local conservation or state agencies doing conservation work that is largely publicly funded, or maybe in academia that is publicly funded. Some of you may be consultants in private development settings. Often what we find is we go to one silo or the other. We're going to be in a setting where it's all public resources or it's all private. And again, I'd urge you to think about the opportunity to connect and reach across and bring resources from both the public and the private sector as you work on solving problems. So what I'm going to speak about today is really that kind of connectivity in the local watershed setting, and specifically what I've come to call conservation corridors. And this goes back to a project that was funded for work that I did by several different partners. One thing you'll know about this old man is I'm technologically challenged. So page down, or David, what button did you press for the next one? It's just like, oh, okay. So I was a part of a project that was funded by Dakota County, the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, and the 9 Mile Creek Watershed District, all concentrating on problems with streams in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, but also by Target and Allina Health. Target had some leadership that was very interested in sustainability and how their mission of creating great places in their stores related to the great communities around them and how they could be a part of that story. And similarly, Allina was interested in health defined not only about what happens inside the clinic or the hospital, but community health, the health of a neighborhood or landscapes and natural resources around them. So they were very interested in this work, especially the cross-sector collaboration pieces of it. So we were focused on 3 streams, Minnehaha Creek, Vermillion, and 9 Mile Creek. All of those streams were suffering some challenges. They are impaired waters, meaning they're on the state list and have challenges dealing with the pollution that they have. They're dealing with land use challenges, the development that's happening or redevelopment on the landscape more impacting those streams, creating really a compromise of habitat for wildlife, and having recreational uses and interests around them. They also were experiencing governance challenges. There were all kinds of different units of government that had something to say about what would happen around those streams. Each of them had private sector interests that you could find as you looked up and down the stream that might have reason to care. And they had an interest then in how local government and the private sector could partner together to create better, more healthy stream corridors. So I'm going to speak about a little bit more about the challenges that are faced in each of these settings. I'm going to step back and think a little bit about how we have approached our thinking about watersheds generally, not only in Minnesota, but all around the country. Talk about greenways and a whole different group of people that have done some planning about greenway corridors, and then how a partnership approach integrating watersheds and greenways might make some sense. So going back to our natural resource challenges, not only in these three streams, but as I think you all know, across the state of Minnesota, we have, for the waters that we've assessed, the stream segments and the lakes, the water bodies in Minnesota, 40% of them we know are impaired and need serious investment, at least $1 billion to address the needs of those impairments. We've lost 42% of our original wetlands, 50% of our pre-settlement forest cover, 99% of our original prairies. So we've lost a lot of habitat due to development on our landscape. We have a growing population, and that population is going to cause us to lose more and more of our natural lands as well as our farmlands. And overall, the growth that we expect to see in Minnesota in terms of population is greatly outpacing our recreational and natural resources. That's not all. Another set of challenges we have relates to governance. If you look at this diagram on the right-hand side, this is just one exercise in trying to understand how state and local government, which agencies in Minnesota deal with water issues and have some legal authority to address water problems. And so if you're a citizen and you want to understand this, this is a hard graphic to negotiate. Another problem we have is the intense focus on short-term perspective. It's not just our corporate sector with a focus on quarterly earnings. We all are looking more and more with 24-hour news cycles and a rapid cycle of information and decision-making. It's harder and harder to do long-term, long-range planning. And many of us are just too busy as citizens to be involved in engaging in these kinds of local community issues. We're busy with our careers, our families, and we're devoting generally less time to our collective civic life. That also means, because these problems are so complex, we tend to, as a matter of professionals, sit down in our silos and concentrate just within our discipline or our sphere of what we know about a problem. So that makes for a challenge in how we approach the quality of our environment and our streams and recreational issues. Let me walk through a quick set of maps to show you why I think it's a mistake to just sit in our silos. This is a map of the 7-county Twin Cities metropolitan area where all of our lakes and streams and rivers are located. This is which of those are impaired. This is the DNR's mapping of conservation corridor areas throughout the metropolitan area that are worthy of regional significance in terms of habitat preservation and should be a priority. This is what it looks like when you link together the impaired waters and the conservation corridors. So the areas we want to preserve are right alongside water bodies that we know are polluted. And this is where our region's parks and trails are located, not coincidentally, right by water bodies. And if you put it all together, what you would see as you drill down is that we're talking about the same real estate and the same areas. What we value is water. That brings recreational value to us. Those water bodies are impaired. The areas that we want to conserve in terms of habitat are right by those water bodies. So we should be trying to break through the silos. We should be thinking about interdisciplinary work and bringing multiple resources and perspectives to try to focus on these issues. If we only decide we have an impaired waters agenda and we're only going to concentrate on getting resources to invest in that, we'll be missing the opportunity to work at the same time on other co-benefits of natural habitat restoration and recreational opportunity. Let me turn for a minute to talk about how we have traditionally thought about watersheds. Now, Minnesota is blessed to have something called watershed districts, which are local units of government with the authority to regulate development and tax and do watershed restoration and protection work. Nationally, if you look all around the country, there is a growing interest in watersheds because we know that that's the scale at which we need to attack water quality problems. But what most watershed organizations around the United States are voluntary associations where they are typically organized by government agencies. Maybe it's a soil and water conservation focus or agricultural extension, but people voluntarily get together and promote watershed health by citizen monitoring, and generally don't have the tools of government at their disposal to really deal and tackle with those watershed issues. And most of these watershed organizations generally are focused on water quality, phosphorus, nutrient pollution, or maybe flooding, but generally are not thinking about habitat, ecosystem integrity, land conservation, land use planning, or other recreational planning. So we have a body of work that we've organized all around the country, and certainly in Minnesota, where we want to concentrate on watershed health. That's typically meant a focus on water quality. At the same time, in our history in Minnesota and all throughout the United States, we have a history of work around greenways. Some of our great urban planners and our great parks planners, going back to Central Park in Manhattan, and in our own Minneapolis history, we have great urban planners who have thought about greenways. And they really have been conceived by a whole different discipline of professionals who are focused on landscape architecture. And they have thought about key areas to conserve that follow a linear path and provide some habitat benefit, some land conservation benefit, and often some recreational benefit. Most of these Greenway initiatives have focused on trails. And so you can think of the Rails to Trails program along old railroad corridors. And you can think of other, your local municipality may have promoted a bicycle trail connecting from one park to the next. What happens usually in these stories, if you trace them, there was a lot of initial opposition. Local landowners didn't like the invasion that would represent of a trail of bicycle users coming into their neighborhood. But once you get one of those trails completed, they're enormously possible, and in fact, an economic engine often of creating a lot of visitor generation and great recreational resource. And many of those were organized with the investment of the local Chamber of Commerce or other economic players that said, we want to make our town a little bit more of a place that people want to come. And if we have a bike trail that connects this town to the next town, what we'll find is that more people want to come because we've defined a place with this great greenway. So my question is, why can't we think about watersheds and greenways together? We have different professional disciplines, different histories for how we've even begun to think about and organizing watersheds and greenways. They've had very different funding sources for how their work has been done, but it's the same real estate. Like that map I showed you of the Twin Cities area, most of these great greenway trails are along streams or connecting one lake to the next, riparian corridors. And it's the water that created the value of the trail or the greenway alongside it. So I just think it's important to see that and start to think about breaking through those silos and thinking about the resources that can come to problem solving from both of those worlds. One of the keys is the importance of creating new partnerships that represent local leaders from not only the local government setting, but also local private sector leadership and local civic leadership. And the key thing about those private sector, public-private partnerships is that when you gather a group of people together who are focused on a particular stream, corridor, and greenway trail, and know that they have some reason to care about it for the long haul. They may be an employer in that community. They may know that they have a hospital sitting in that community. and know by virtue of their investment, they're going to be here for the long haul. So what happens this year along that trail, yeah, that matters. But it really matters what's going to happen over the next 10. So they have a long-term economic interest in the health and the vibrancy of their community and this particular place. Once we can get all of those players to the table who all have some kind of agreed upon long-term shared interest in this place, in this stream corridor or this trail or this community, we will start to discover that they all have their own investment plans. All of our economic actors are thinking about the long term one way or another, and they have their 5 and 10 and even 20-year investment plans, their capital investment plans. Well, why should those plans all sit in isolation? Why can't they come to this table, and why can't each of the actors share what their long-term investments are? If we do that, we're going to start to discover that they overlap and that there can be a powerful synergy of when you move one partner's investment to fit and move alongside another's, and before you know it, 1 + 1 equals more than 2. I'm going to give you some really specific examples of that in a moment. Once local leaders start to agree that they share a long-term stake in a place, and they're willing to start to think about their investments and getting them more aligned more effectively, what happens after that is the rest of us take notice. The rest of us are noticing people are talking about this Greenway and suddenly see that there's some value in it for them. And suddenly we're mobilizing what I call the civic will, that this place is now important. And before you know it, other organizations are going to be drawn to it because this is a place of value. And maybe foundations are going to be motivated to invest and share in this agenda. So that's the power of gathering both public and private local leaders to this same table. So my thought is that this engagement with the private sector is possible. Sometimes in these local government or environmental conservation discussions, people are surprised to hear that the private sector really might care. And my message to you is yes, but you need to make a very specific approach in which you've carefully analyzed what people's long-term self-interests are. And the key then is to integrate what you want to do in your natural resource management, in your water resource management, with the agendas and the long-term investments of these other key actors who are affecting your landscape. Let me give you one quick example of what I'm talking about. In Minneapolis, there's something called the Midtown Greenway that connects the Mississippi River to the chain of lakes. It's an old abandoned rail corridor for many years, and it was acquired by Hennepin County. Ultimately, they thought for light rail transit use. But in the meantime, community advocates said, why can't we have a bicycle corridor here? And sure enough, they mobilized local government leaders to think about how those resources might come together. They also knew that Lake Street was a major commercial corridor, so you had one block apart, this Greenway and Lake Street, and you really need to think about them as a comprehensive corridor. Then a group of partners all came together to decide they wanted to work together to think about how both public investments in this Greenway, Lake Street corridor could leverage private investments. So Target came to the table. Allina Health System had its major flagship hospital, Abbott Northwestern, and they came to the table. And Wells Fargo, which bought the Honeywell campus right there on the Midtown Greenway, decided they would be there alongside the city of Minneapolis, Hennepin County, and the Metropolitan Council. One of the first things they did as a group was to hire a consulting firm to look at transportation projects. They knew that this Greenway was going to be an important transportation corridor for pedestrians and bicycles, ultimately maybe someday transit, and then Lake Street is a major thoroughfare. So they wanted to look at who was planning transportation projects touching this corridor. They found that there were 12 different local government agencies and state agencies all busy planning some kind of project that touched this Midtown Greenway and Lake Street corridor. 12. And they had together really more often individually, created 36 different projects that they had on the drawing board. Many of these projects could not be built without colliding with other projects on this list. And while it cost at least $200 million, not counting light rail transit, to build these 36 projects, they only had $2 million in hand of committed funding. So this partnership said, well, let's all together as local government and private sector and community leaders agree on what we think the priorities should be of all these 36 projects. And let's get behind those. And let's send out the signal to funding agencies that these are the important projects, and we all agree that they are. And sure enough, we agreed that reconstructing Lake Street, completing the construction of the Midtown Greenway were our high priorities, along with the Hiawatha Light Rail Transit line. So that was a powerful exercise right in itself. If you think about all the different silos busy planning their own projects, and they were all going to collide with each other, getting to agreement by virtue of that exercise and the long-term view about priorities was critical. So that was one piece, but what we did then, the McKnight Foundation decided that it would fund a comprehensive redevelopment framework to look at the long-term plan, knitting together all the different interests in this corridor and prioritize a vision for what it would look like. The Bush Foundation decided it would fund a master plan for public art opportunities along this corridor. Target decided that it would fund a study to evaluate the design of all the different bridges over the Greenway and how the design of those bridges could, all needing replacement, by the way, they were nearly 100 years old, how that could be an artistic opportunity and a placemaking exercise. They also funded a whole marketing program for the businesses along Lake Street that were impacted by the Lake Street construction. We also sensed that there was an opportunity for housing to be built along the Midtown Greenway, but no developer wanted to be the first one. So we created a special bridge financing fund that Wells Fargo led the way, but collected a lot of common investors. And it was a way to get, for the first developer to get site access and clean up that site and build and demonstrate the potential for apartments and other housing condominiums along this Midtown Greenway that used to be an old, neglected, derelict trench, now becoming a vital amenity and people declaring an important place. Fast forward to today, we have nearly 5,000 units of housing that have been built along the Midtown Greenway, all focused on the value of this Greenway as an amenity that didn't exist before. Alina decided to locate its corporate headquarters in the old Sears building, which is now called Midtown Exchange, which was the Sears building had sat empty for 15 years. And they came, and it was being at this table discussing the Greenway that was the leverage and the inspiration for them to locate here. They created the Midtown Bike Center in their facility. Wells Fargo moved its whole home mortgage operation to the Honeywell campus, and together they all worked with neighborhoods up and down the Greenway, have planted on Arbor Day over 5,000 trees for the last 20 years. In the interest of time, I'm going to march through a couple other settings and show you how this approach of thinking about integrating greenways and watersheds and public-private partnership is a way to do this work effectively and leverage more resources. In the Vermillion River in Dakota County, there are all kinds of sensitive impairment issues, including temperature, and there's a whole effort to plan a whole corridor approach to conservation and improvement of the Vermillion River. There's a natural resource protection plan that's focused on key areas along that corridor, and alongside that, some recreational planning, again, the same real estate. So you have natural resources conservation, water impairments, and recreational planning have so much more value when they're done together. So that's what built this integrated corridor concept. And then we developed a whole approach to governance for that that involved coordinating funding, integrating the policies of the county, the local municipalities, the watershed organization, thinking about park resources, funding to deal with impairments in the stream and other land conservation opportunities, and then generating private sector interest for major landowners, including commercial landowners that are up and down that corridor. In the 9 Mile Creek area, which is in Bloomington, Edina, Minnehaha area, this is a stream that is also dealing with impairments with turbidity, biological integrity, but also salt and chloride. And mostly because this is an intensely developed watershed, sending a lot more volume of stormwater there, a lot more flashiness of the stream, more erosion, but that's also where the chloride from all the hard surface coming from snow and ice management. So quickly, this group saw that they had a lot of work to do to repair this stream environment, and reducing salt was a key agenda for them. As they went through and did a chloride TMDL, they quickly discovered that if they got every road plowing entity, be that municipalities or county or MnDOT, to the table, it would not be enough to solve the salt problem. If you looked at the allocation of land uses, there were 25% of the land use in that watershed was some form of commercial, but 37% of the chloride load was coming from those commercial settings. So what they quickly figured out is they had to reach out to the private sector who had major campus presence in their watershed and really start promoting best practices in terms of chloride management. One of the things they recognize that they have to go beyond their regulatory permitting function and proactively think about ways they can get partnerships going to create voluntary buffers, do some more stormwater retention on site than might be required just as a matter of regulatory permitting, and promote best practices in terms of salting and parking lot management. I'm going to move over to Minnehaha Creek briefly, which has a nice history of cultivating partnerships. First with the Minneapolis chain of lakes, they brought together 6 different agency partners to invest millions and millions of dollars to improve water quality in the Minneapolis lakes. At the intersection of 394 and Highway 100 is the West End development, which when it came in was a partnership with the Watershed District, which single-handedly achieved the TMDL load allocation reduction for Brownie Lake, which was an impaired water body downstream. They've partnered with Methodist Hospital, with Bachman's, and a number of other landowners up and down the corridor of Minnehaha Creek. The key approach that they have followed is to think beyond their own permitting function as a regulator and beyond their own projects that they would use taxpayer money to build, but to discover opportunities when commercial projects are being constructed to partner and encourage those large-scale commercial developers to think about ways they could contribute more resources to better outcomes for water resources. A big part of this work then has been to integrate their water resource planning with the land use planning of their local community partners, and to also be aware of transportation planning within their watershed. And a key piece is recognizing that you can do a great water resource plan just as an engineering exercise where you gather monitoring data, you look at hydrologic models, and you think about where your water quality and flooding problems are and identify the pinch points. And as an exercise, that can be complete. You can identify some important projects to be done. But if you are not paying attention to who the economic actors are in that watershed and where investment is happening and where construction will be happening, you're really missing the opportunity for where the changes on the landscape are going to be impacting water resources, where you could be co-investing with them in those outcomes. And if you get early enough into the discussion with these projects, you'd be surprised at how much water quality and other environmental benefits you can achieve through partnership that doesn't necessarily involve more public funds. A couple of examples of how to think about this. Methodist Hospital is located right on Minnehaha Creek, and it's a section of Minnehaha Creek that was straight. And why was it straight? Well, because when we were developing St. Louis Park in the 40s and 50s, creeks weren't supposed to be straight. We straightened them out so you could build land right up against it. So we have industrial parks right along straight line ditched creeks. We've now come further in our watershed management understanding to realize that's not a healthy stream. And actually, people like to be by healthy streams. They like to walk along them, bicycle along them, even locate their businesses near them or their homes near them. And the more you create a great creek environment the way Mother Nature intended, in fact, the more property value will emerge around them. So what Methodist Hospital realized was that the outdoor environment has a role to play in health. And if patients can, while they're there for a week or so with maybe it's a heart issue, if they can go outside and walk alongside a wetland or a creek, and that's part of the healing environment that Methodist has to offer, that's a unique value proposition for them. And the health literature bears out that they get better outcomes. So they were, once we had this discussion with them, they were eager to invest and help build this restoration of the creek, a re-meandering of the creek environment, build a boardwalk alongside of it. And once we did that, we discovered that there were other partners up and down that creek corridor who had something to do. Japs Olson, one of the largest printing companies in the metro area, has 700 employees, badly needed to expand its facility, and they were right against the creek. We convinced them to invest money in a restoration so that they did have parking, but they redid all of their property so that it would be a great amenity for their own employees as well as for the community right by Minnehaha Creek. We went and bought a cold storage facility, 16 acres at 325 Blake Road, and have now demolished that and are going to rebuild some kind of housing development that has a small part of the footprint, and the rest will be for public purpose, greenway, stormwater treatment, and again, reinforcing the natural environment. So what Minnehaha Creek found was once they start to have a dialogue with one private partner and convince one partner to think about the creek as a resource worthy of their investment, before you knew it, the neighbors up and down the stream were thinking the same way. And so they've leveraged millions and millions of dollars of private investment in the restoration of the Minnehaha Creek environment, creating much more value for the local tax base in Hopkins and St. Louis Park, and also a much higher quality environment dealing with a lot of the stormwater pollution from these neighboring watersheds. And by the way, also partnering with the planning of the light rail, Southwest Light Rail Transit Line, which has 2 stations right in this area. When I get in these conversations about public-private partnership, people always think of obstacles or barriers to why you might approach work in this way. And one of the first questions I get is it really the job of the public sector to be partnering, or isn't your job to be the policeman or the police officers to regulate and protect the environment? And what we've learned from experience is it would be a big mistake to throw all of your rules and regulations out the window and only concentrate on voluntary partnership. You need strong, well-conceived regulation to establish the floor by which you are going to require everybody to protect the environment as they change the landscape. But if everyone sees that clarity and what that floor is, and alongside that are invited to the table to think creatively about how they can achieve even better outcomes, you'd be surprised at how many people are eager to engage in that conversation. The key is to not just think about a voluntary activity in lieu of, instead of achieving your minimum regulatory goals. You need that floor. That's very important. Sometimes my friends in non-governmental organizations doing environmental work will look at this kind of public-private partnership and say, well, wait a minute, why are you dealing with, don't you understand the bad agenda that these private sector players have? Why would you want to do collaborative work with these bad actors who really aren't harming the environment? And my answer to that is, that's kind of a black hat and white hat kind of analysis. And I get that because, in fact, let's be clear, there are corporate and other private actors who've done a lot of bad things harming the environment and make a lot of money at it. And we shouldn't just kind of sit down at the table with them and say, okay, how can we do a couple of things around the edges to make you feel better and then I'll make it look better. What I'm talking about, though, is a world of a lot of gray hats where if you know what your mission is as a public entity and you're clear about protection and restoration of the environment and you have clear rules that are going to require that, the opportunity to engage with the private sector and think creatively about how they can contribute even more resources to make the place they're planted in even better and healthier. You're going to be surprised at how much more progress you might make with that approach. One of the other things we find from the private sector is, oh, somebody else is coming asking for a contribution, and what I call charity fatigue. And so if you come into this conversation and approach your private sector partners as one more checkbook to get some resources for your project, I think you're going to be disappointed. What you need to do is really think about how to organize a table of investors who all have self-interest in mind. Our local communities are clear about their self-interest. Our private sector players are clear. And the key is long-term self-interest, not what's just happening this quarter or this month. But if you as a private sector entity are going to be here for the long haul, you have an agenda of what you're going to be investing in your facility, in your building, in your grounds. What if we would help you make smarter investments alongside your neighbors who are also going to be investing along the creek? And what if we were a part of creating a much greater environment for which a much better destination for people to come to, for your patients or your visitors or your customers? And that then leverages serious investment money, not just the charitable contribution checkbook. So that's another key piece to think about long-term strategic business interests. So to wrap up and get to your great questions, I just want to summarize by saying the watersheds and greenways are examples of where we have in the past worked in silos, where water resource engineers have focused on watersheds and landscape architects have focused on greenways. And think about how much more we could achieve. We're talking about the same real estate. Many of these greenways are right alongside streams. What we could do to integrate the planning and then the resources. And think about also, as we do this work, the role that the private sector has to play, the stake that our private sector entities have in the quality of life and the quality of our environment, and how they can be a great resource of leverage alongside the public investments. The key to getting that done is to create a table of people who agree they have a long-term stake in this place, and start to think about all the different policy decisions that are being made by local units of government and by other actors, and how you can integrate those policies and agree on priorities, taking those 36 different projects that collide with each other and agreeing on the top 3 that everybody supports. And then how you can align your own investments and leverage other people's investments to make those priorities happen. You'll find that that suddenly is a magnet for citizen interest and generating civic will to declare that this place, this creek, this stream, this lake, this trail is important, and we're going to care for it, and we're going to invest in it together. So I want to thank you for just taking the time on a Friday afternoon. I'd love to have more discussion with whatever this has prompted for you. I'm just grateful to be in the room with you. Thank you. Doug.
So you talk about with the Midtown Greenway, thanks for coming, by the way. You talk about finding 36 different projects going on and then narrowing it down to 3. And even figuring out that on that long, narrow corridor, there are 36 different projects going on. Could you tell a little more about how you even figured that out?
Yes. So we had a consultant who knew the transportation world to start with. And we mapped out and discovered these 12 different agencies that we thought would be busy doing something. And we just went to them one at a time and say, what's in your planning for this geography? And collected them one by one by one. And one of the things I would say about this kind of work is the value of sitting down with people one-on-one and just really listening and dialing into what it is that they have planned for a place or that they care about. You'll learn a lot about what their interests are. So this was an exercise of collecting those. It's, painful, hard work, one by one by one. But then when you saw this list, you discovered, well, wait a minute, this group over here wants to build a project going this way and making a turn. And this project, another entity is coming over here. You can't build those two projects. And they hadn't thought to really compare notes with each other. Back there.
It's a little topic, but I mean, since I'm currently mostly learning about scientific subject, but in some class we talk about the debate between like science and policy. In your opinion, what do you think is the biggest blind spot for the people who learn science? As a person that's involved.
So a blind spot for people working in science. We had some good discussion earlier in the day about the interface and sometimes the conflict between science and law and policy. And I think this in part gets to this nature of realizing the other disciplines bring value to the equation. So in my work, in my watershed work, I'm an attorney working directly with engineers all the time. And it took me a long time to learn their language. Okay, and it takes, and they don't have the greatest thing to say about lawyers either. But we've learned to speak each other's language and appreciate what each has to offer. And so I think if you're in a science career now, with your technical background and understanding, you're going to run head into public policy and just about anywhere you turn, whether it's local government policy or state or federal. And we need policy discussions that are science-based and science-informed. So I'd urge you in your technical careers to make sure that you have some exposure to public policy and understand that discussion and understand how rules and decisions are made in local government settings or whatever arena you're dealing with. Because you can be very influential. You're bringing science and technical expertise to the table, but you need to be able to speak the policy language. And I think the blind spot sometimes, again, is from each of our disciplines, especially in our younger years. We're really focused on building our credentials. We want our resume to show how technically competent and smart we are by the research and the work we've done in this area. Because you want to get as far down the road of the knowledge as you can. And you kind of want to show what you're contributing to the literature that nobody else has thought of and how, but that can be a narrowing exercise. And so my urge would be, my plea would be to keep thinking about what other disciplines are saying about the same problem you're thinking about and learn how to speak the policy language so you can contribute your scientific expertise. Yes, Jack.
So coming with that policy framework, with all these initiatives going from small scale private sectors and public entities. On a larger scale, zooming out, what sort of policy would be put in place that would lay a foundation that would improve the abilities of these initiatives to kick off and be hands-off still, not like so concrete, maybe analogous to how the Clean Water Fund, all it does is raise money. What that money is used for is they're kind of like letting the control be designated out so people come up with a clever idea whenever they come up with it. Maybe like, for example, like high-risk sites in Minnesota or environmental degradation or destruction, like flooding zones that have neighborhoods built in them. Like once they flood, maybe it's a buyout program instead of rebuilding. And that creates a foundational aspect of what can you do with it once it's bought out, or infiltration sites for groundwater, a couple 100,000 acres that are prime infiltration sites, but they're all in production for ag land. How can you move that out and push that policy around it? What kind of state level, top down things could be put in place that don't hamper ideas in the long run?
So I'm going to interpret your question a little bit. What I hear behind your question is, how can we tackle really important big problems at scale?
Yeah.
How can we encourage innovation? The temptation, especially at, say, the state government scale, is with either funding or policy to design the solutions there and kind of impose them locally, and then maybe miss opportunities for innovation. Is that part of what you're asking?
Exactly what I'm asking.
Okay. So one of the message I really try to carry into this conversation is to, first of all, don't miss the opportunity for private funding and private contributions and investment in the solution. Because usually in the legislature or in other settings where we're making state policy, the focus is just on use of public resources. So that's one piece to keep in mind. I've also found that there's if you convene a group of stakeholders and agree on the kinds of outcomes you're seeking, and create some regulatory threshold that's going to require a minimum amount of stewardship or investment or what it is, and then really open up performance creativity to get there a variety of ways, you'll find that the private sector will respond to that. And what they really appreciate is clarity about what the outcome needs to be, and maybe some minimal rules about what they must do to comply. Because if it's too ambiguous about what compliance looks like, that's very frustrating. But if you have some clear outcomes and some clear minimal rules, and then offer an alternative opportunity, if you can achieve these same outcomes in a different way that works better for you and even is better for the environment, we embrace that. So I'm most familiar with that in the local watershed setting, where we've come to really find ways to engage in early conversation, being really strict about this environmental outcome we have to have with a development project, make sure that the stormwater management plan is just cutting edge best practice. But if you have problems with doing that and you want to put your thinking hat on and come back creatively with some different solution, I think you want to engender and encourage that kind of thinking. But usually the private sector wants a clear statement of what the minimal framework is, and then an opportunity to creatively come at it another way, but to get to the same environmental outcome. Doug?
Is that the best way to motivate the private sector?
So we're talking about in the environmental natural resource arena. And I think of a variety of appeals to make to the private sector. And it really depends on the issues. Are we talking about agricultural landscapes and we want to make pitches on the best practices for agricultural production as it might impact water quality? That's one kind of conversation. Are we talking about salt chloride practices on commercial parking lots. The key to me has been to think a lot about long-term interest and really appeal to someone's own strategic interest for why maybe they will get better agricultural production using cover crops, or they might get better prices for growing Japanese millet instead of corn, or whatever it is. But thinking about long-term interest, long-term stewardship, and creating a conversation about shared values around the environment and land and water quality and sustainability. And then just be proactive about understanding their self-interest and try to find a variety of creative ways to get there. Yes?
You talked a little bit about public perception of these partnerships.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on what that engagement sort of looked like, that outreach?
Yes, it's one of the most important pieces to get right, and I've learned from mistakes. So, and I'm just going to commend a great book that deals with this at a more elite level, and that's called Winners Take All by Anand. Have you heard of it? Can you say Anand's last name for me?
I cannot.
Shira Hasadas, something like that. Really powerful book about the illusion of elites doing win-win solutions, solving environmental or other problems, when in fact it's just playing on the surface and really excluding other stakeholders from being at the table. And so at a much more local level, what that looks like to me is when I do work in a neighborhood, we're working with the priorities of the neighborhood organization. We're not coming with other big corporate stakeholders or other political leaders and saying, here's what we're going to do for you. We're making sure that we start with an invitation to come into the neighborhood, and we look at what they have already declared to be their priorities, and then we think about how our private sector or other partners could be resources to make those goals happen more successfully. And it's been really critical to make sure you cultivate a table where people feel welcome and it's open and transparent. Sometimes the quality of that engagement process and the amount of time and effort it takes can be overwhelming. And people that are in a hurry to get things done, often people in the private sector are in a hurry to get things done. They're not used to 10 meetings to make a decision. You have kind of a culture clash here. So you have to cultivate and understand sustainability. And sustainability also includes political community support for whatever it is you're doing. And you need good understanding, and that takes more time. But I've learned the hard way that if you think you have quick solutions and you want to make things happen quickly and you haven't done your homework and really engage in true partnership, you're gonna pay.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
If there's some refreshments outside. Have an opportunity to come out and talk to us outside.
That's because there's 4 inches outside already.
Is that already?
I think so.
You're not as excited as I am with it, you know? See, that's why I don't have to drive.
Because you said they're not. I know what the darn talking about.
But it's been going on for a while.
Yeah, yeah.
There have been a few times smoking outside. It's not as windy as some of the last storms, but it's crowded.